Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We discuss topics relevant to developing for the modern web and the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Web Platform Podcast. I.O. is coming, but we're not there yet. I'm one of your hosts today, Justin Ribeiro. Join me as usual, Mr. Danny Blue.
Hello, everybody.
Mr. Leon Revill.
Hello, everyone.
And today we're talking about web workers. But before we kick off our discussion about just how the magicalness of off-main thread web workers work, let's go to This Week in the Web in 2 minutes or less with Leon. Leon?
Thank you very much, Justin. So first of all, we've got some news that Chrome Canary gets JavaScript modules. We mentioned in a previous episode that this was already in Safari. It's behind a flag in the next version of Firefox also, and it's in a preview release of Microsoft Edge. So it's really nice to see JavaScript modules coming to major browsers. TypeScript 2.3 has been released. Firefox 53 arrives with new themes and a separate graphics process. Node.js 8 has been delayed until the end of May. There's early bird tickets available for JSConf Belgium, so if you're in Europe and looking for your next JavaScript conference, there's still a chance to get early bird tickets for that. And finally, I'm pleased to announce I have published my first Pluralsight course, A Practical Guide to Vanilla Web Components. So my favorite topic, check that out, learn all about web components. And that's it for 2 minutes in web this week.
Yeah, that's some interesting JavaScript stuff happening. JSConf EU just finished up this last weekend too. I heard that was quite the there were some amazing talks there as well.
JavaScript modules getting into browsers, it feels strange. Like, it doesn't feel like something that is actually happening, but it is. It's something that's actively happening.
It's been a long time coming. I mean, just generally, like
I feel like people had pretty much relegated modules to be the domain of bundling tools.
Yeah, it opens up a whole new world to web development. You know, a future where maybe, you know, bundling tools and build process tools are not such a prominent part of our everyday life. It's crazy to think about.
Well, you know, tools, you know, what will I keep around in my toolbox of things? I mean, I need more tools in my life, Leon. I need more. No, I don't. I don't. They're so complicated sometimes. Speaking of complicated things, hey, let's talk about web workers.
Woo!
Woo! It seems to be like I enjoy web workers, yet every time I mention them in just general conversation, I always get the strangest looks as if I've just made up a set of technology that exists that didn't exist previously. But web workers have been around for a long time, and a lot of people don't seem to realize they exist.
Yeah, so the episode this week is specifically about web worker adoption, you know, discussing why it seems that web workers aren't as used in many places that they probably should be. You know, why don't people use them a lot? Is there reasons behind that? But first of all, if we can kick off with what exactly web workers are and how web workers might differ from something like service workers, that'd be really good.
Do you guys want me to tackle that?
Yeah, go for it.
All right. So starting off with just what web workers are. So the browser, so JavaScript is single-threaded. The language itself runs in a single thread, and the browser runs every website in one thread all the way. So as an experiment, if you wanted to, for example, if you wanted to just create a loop of 100,000, your browser will eventually, I don't know if 100,000 would do it, but your browser would eventually throw up the little crash thing and say, like, there's a script that's running and it's running infinitely and it can't do anything else. So if you have a loop of 100,000 things running, you can't do anything else while that code is running. So say you start that loop, but you also have an event listener where you want to handle, you know, if somebody clicks a button, that won't work until that loop is completed. So what web workers bring to the table is the ability to send code off of the main UI thread into a separate thread where you can do all that sort of work. Do you guys think that's an apt description?
Yeah, absolutely. And these kind of problems are more prominent nowadays. I mean, years ago, doing complex stuff, in some JavaScript code wasn't really a thing. You just, showing and hiding images or something with jQuery. But nowadays, where you've got lots of complicated business logic running in your UI thread, you need some way to kind of pass that off so you're not going to, degrade the user experience.
Yeah. And I think one of the easiest examples to give is if for some reason you have to filter or sort a large set in the browser. And so I actually did this, it was a while ago now. But there was a project we were working on, and for some reason we ended up needing to do we ended up needing to do some filtering and sorting in the browser. So this is not to argue whether or not we should have done it there. This is what happened. But we couldn't do it in the main thread, or as soon as you would click on a column to order some stuff, the whole thing would freeze not for very long, but it would still freeze, and it was obvious, and it was really, really terrible. Because you can't even throw it, if you have a nice load, animation to show that something is loading, that'll freeze, that'll stop. Everything, if it's a GIF, it'll stop. It'll all stop. It's all on one thread. So what we would do is, that is one use case. The way that you do that is that you take a data set, you pass it off to this separate thread, do something to it, and then send it back. And it does this with the post message API. So you can create an instance of your web worker, say post message, and send a valid JSON data structure over. It has to be valid JSON. You can't pass functions or anything like that. It has to adhere to the I forgot what it's called. Strict cloning or something like that. I don't think that's right. But the point is that it has to be JSON. It'll fail if not. You pass all of that data over to the thread. It does whatever it needs to do, and then it sends another message out of itself that you can listen to and then act on accordingly.
Yeah, and also there's some limitations in what you can do in a web worker as well. So you mentioned that you can't pass objects over via the post message. For example, document isn't available in a web worker, so you couldn't pass the document object over to a web worker and do something with the DOM or anything like that.
Yeah, so the document and the window are something I think you can think of as part of that main UI thread. A new thread that's started by a web worker doesn't have, it's not only that it's running a separate thread, you can't touch the DOM from that thread. Now you can interact with some other things, so you can interact with with local storage. I think local storage, maybe not local storage, but you can interact with so you can send notifications from there. You can interact with local databases and things like that. But you can't render any UI from there. So it's all for structured cloning. Thank you, Justin. But yeah, so it is very restrictive about what exactly you can do, and so there are technical reasons for that as well. But if you're coming from other languages where maybe multi-threading is more common, I was talking to a friend of mine that I've mentioned on this podcast before. His name's Aaron. First time I started talking to him about web workers, he was like, "Oh, this sounds like something in some language." He's an old man, so it's something in some language he's worked on before, and said that they seemed very restrictive, but they also seem to be very restrictive, I think, by design as well, because they're very safe. You can't. It's very difficult to shoot yourself in the foot while using them.
Yeah, because as far as I understand it, it can often be you can get yourself in some crazy situations when you start talking multi-threaded in a lot of other languages, where I think, you're right, web workers have been designed to be very simplistic and, like you said, very safe.
Yeah. So actually, that actually just reminded me of one other thing. Web workers are not a feature of JavaScript. Web workers are a browser feature. Because I know I've listened to other podcasts and read some other stuff where people, like, well, can you use web workers in Node and that kind of stuff? No, this is all said. This is a feature of the browser versus a feature of JavaScript, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're basically getting concurrency, right? I mean, this is the grand scheme of things, which, it's not designed with concurrency necessarily in mind.
No. Yeah, so it's that's just a thing that I've seen people not just with web workers, but when you run into certain things like, oh, this is in the browsers now, but like whether or not it's a feature of the language itself or it's a feature of the environment that it's running in. This is a case where it's a feature of the environment that it's running in.
Yeah. Well, I think there is one.
Go
ahead, Justin. Go ahead. No, it's fine.
Well, I think that you bring up an interesting point, which is it's a feature of browsers, but it's also a feature that's been in browsers for a while.
Yes, it has.
This is one of those things that I used to use in IE 10. Like, I don't believe IE 9 had it, but it's been around for quite some time, and it's been very useful in the context of sort of needing to process data. Yet developers don't quite seem to know it's there, which was unfortunate because they're pretty cool to use overall.
Yeah, well, when I looked at caniuse.com, it blew my mind. I was like, oh my god, why is this not used on a lot more situations? Because it goes back even to the older IE browsers. It's incredible. Yeah,
and it's I don't know exactly why they're not really in the public, like the public developer mindset a lot. I mean, that's obviously a very blanket statement. I'm sure there are plenty of people out there that are listening that use them and work with them pretty frequently, but they seem to be like, when I first learned about them, I was like, oh, this is really it was that exact same discovery process where I don't remember how I stumbled across them, but I was just like, why has no one told me about this before? Oh, they must not be that well supported. Maybe it's just in Chrome or something like that. And then you look at the support table, and it's just like, oh, holy crap, this is really easy. This is actually, I think, one of the first examples of progressive enhancement that I ever myself implemented, which was pretty much it was filtering that large data set that if you were in a browser that didn't support web workers, it would just do it in the main UI thread and it would freeze up and whatever, but it would still work. And then if you were in a browser that supported web workers, it would pitch that over to another. It would pitch it over to the other thread, and everything was much nicer. But yeah, they're at least supported all the way back to IE 11, which I know for some people is not far enough. But I believe, like Justin said, I believe they also work in IE 10. I know they are not in IE 9, but just because they're not in IE 9, it is fairly trivial to reuse some of that. To use them where applicable, this is also one of the things where I got interested in the different ways that you can create web workers, creating them inline versus a separate file. And I don't know if we want to get into some of that stuff yet, but
yeah, it'd be nice if you can describe the kind of standard way of how do you create a web worker, how do you give it work to do, and what does that look like in a typical application, and then maybe we could get into alternatives.
All right. Okay. So the standard way that you create a web worker is you create a separate file. So myworker.js, something clever like that, and inside of it you have access to this self object. And a self has, so you can, it acts as the window, as it were, of the main thread. And you can listen for something called onMessage. And that just means to do something whenever a message is sent into this thread. So you listen for onMessage, keep going with our filter example. OnMessage, here's the data object that comes in. do whatever filtering I need to do, and then I would say self.postMessage and send it back. So I have that separate file all nice and wrapped up. And then what you do in your main thread is there is a worker class. So you would say new worker and pass in a path to that JavaScript file. And then when your application runs, it fetches that file, gets it all loaded up, and then you can from that object you've created, you can say .post message, send whatever data, and then also listen for changes coming back from it. So that's the standard way, and that's the default way, and that is, I believe, is the fastest way. One of the things that I ran into when I first started working with them, as far as progressive enhancement stuff goes, is that I was duplicating logic. So I would have some logic. So you have a function, you have your filter function that does whatever. And filters it a certain way. Well, I was having to duplicate that because I would have to write that function in my web worker file, and then I would also have to pretty much just copy it to use when web workers weren't available, and that of course is difficult to maintain and all that kind of stuff. So you can get around that in a couple of ways. One of the ways is there's actually a method available to you inside of web workers called import script and import scripts, and this is actually this is not JavaScript modules. This is a way to load separate. But it kind of sounds like it, but it's not. But it's a way to import other JavaScript files into your web worker code. So, for example, if you need to use moment.js or something like that in there to do some stuff, you can say import and then a path to whatever other file you need to pull in. So that's a way that you can handle it. So you can create one file and separate it out, and then pull it into your, for example, into your main bundle, but then also dynamically include it in your worker code. One of the things that I ended up finding interesting was creating inline or embedded web workers, and so what I mean for this, I actually forgot about this, but I have a Medium article about doing just this that we can link to. But the way that it works is that you create a function, you create your filter function, which is whatever. You turn that function into a string, so you call toString on your function, and then you create a blob from that string. So you create so new blob, pass in an array, and then add this function as the first item in that array. And then you create an object URL from that blob, and then when you call new worker, you pass in that object URL that you just created instead of a path to not physical file, but path to an external file, which sounds odd, and it kind of is. It feels a bit messy, but you wrap that in one function that's called create web worker, and it feels much better. And then you can just pass functions in. So then what you can do is you can say, okay, here's my filter function. You can just create a web worker out of that, and I think some of that feels like a bit more natural when you're getting used to it. But it causes a few other headaches in that you have to keep track of what is and is not available inside of that function, because your normal closures and all that kind of stuff do not apply in this case, because you're doing weird things with that function.
Yeah. Are there any kind of performance implications to doing it that way? You mentioned that the fastest way would be to have the separate file and that kind of stuff. Have you done any performance metrics on that, or seen any? So
I haven't done any actual performance metrics on it, but I've seen some discussions by people much smarter than me. And I can't think of any names off the top of my head that were talking about the different ways to create them. And apparently it is faster to do it the other way. And part of it is just because there's less processing that's done at the beginning, because you have to blob, you have to create the object URL. And for those that aren't really familiar, a blob is another construct that just represents some data. And then an object URL. So I actually think there's a URL object on the window, and then I think it's called create object URL, and you can pass in a blob, and if you just log that out, it is a valid URL that you can go to. But yeah, so there's some trade-offs if you do it that way. I've done it that way for a few things, and I've done it the more standard way for some others, and there are some trade-offs. I think overall I would recommend, especially if you're figuring them out, I would definitely recommend starting with the standard way first, before you decide if you want to mess around using embedded ones, because your separation, it's easier to figure out what's going on where. When it's sitting off in another file, it's much easier to reason how you're supposed to interact with it. Because for a lot of other stuff, like I said, closures don't work. It feels like this little bit of code that doesn't follow the rules of JavaScript anymore.
Yeah, and there's a lot of power though in being able to programmatically create segments of code that run in a web worker, isn't there? Instead of having to, have the file kind of pre-created already, ready to be running one. It's really, really useful.
Yeah, I know. I'm sure you can do a lot of really clever things, with it. But if you think about it, at the end of the day, all you're doing is string parsing. Like that's what it is. Like that is the step for creating the code. Is you are constructing a string. Then you can do that really however you want, but it is a string of stuff that once you put it over there, it's going to run. So it's fast. It's really interesting. But like I said, maybe start with the standard way first.
Yeah, I mean the standard way. I mean, you're talking like 8 lines of code.
Yeah, no, it's well. So I will say, doing it the non-standard way is only 3 lines of code, but you have to understand what a blob is and then what an object URL is. So just saying, it's not that many more lines of code. It just takes a lot longer to explain.
And it's probably worth mentioning that there is actually some overhead in creating a web worker as well. So, it's not like you should just put everything in a web worker. I did some experiments with image processing. So again, you can't manipulate canvases or anything directly, anything DOM related in a web worker. But I passed off the image data to a web worker and manipulated it in various different ways. And it actually turns out that in the specific experiments that I was doing, maybe I wasn't doing it quite right or whatever, doing it on the single UI thread was actually faster. However, it locks up the UI. So the key thing here is that even though sometimes it's not quicker to do it in a web worker, the user experience is much better because it's taking longer to do something, but the user's able to do other things while that process is happening.
Yeah. So and we've mentioned the idea of perceived performance quite a few times.
Yeah.
Since we, on this show, and that's a really good example where the in terms of milliseconds, it's faster. It's faster just to do it in the main thread, but it feels like it's much faster and the user experience is better when it gets passed off to a separate thread. And when you think about it, it makes sense because you have to think about what you have to do is you have to take data, you have to send it over to somewhere else. It has to do something to it and it has to send it back. And so like when you pass an object of any kind, so say you just have a JavaScript array and you pass that over, it doesn't pass a reference to that. So it doesn't just point to the same object. It actually has to create an entire new one. So every time, which is where that structured cloning thing comes in. There is a concept of something called shared workers where you can actually pass off ownership of an object. I think this is it. You can pass off ownership of an object to a different thread other than the UI thread.
Well, you can use transferable objects, right? I mean,
Okay.
So if you have something that's very large with a massive amount of overhead, like a big array buffer or whatever, and you try to pass that with structured cloning, the problem is that it takes time, right? Because you're doing a copy op. So the kicker is that if you use transferable objects, it's basically passed by reference. So if you're from if you're familiar with pass by reference. The only difference being is that unlike pass by reference, which is basically a zero copy, you don't, from a worker standpoint, you lose the calling context is no longer available. So basically, you end up saying, "Here, take this. I don't want it," and then the caller doesn't know anything more about that. You get the zero copy, and so you get the performance. But unlike pass by reference, where you basically have a pointer to it, it doesn't quite work that way. The nice thing is that you get a lot of performance out of that. So, and this is one of those things that not a lot of people are aware of. Primarily because I'm almost positive it came out at least 5 years ago.
Transferable objects or web workers?
Transferable objects, because that was a flag. It was basically for a .post message or whatever. Like you could send it it's the second or third option, I think, in terms of like the transferable list or whatever it is. So you can use that, and there's, in terms of overall performance against structured sort of copy or cloning, rather, transferable objects give you quite a perf boost.
Yeah, but so the other thing to watch out with transferable objects, one, transferable objects are not as well supported as just normal web workers. Vanilla plain web workers have the really wide adoption. I think you have to check for some of those specific features. But so if you have a thing that you have to watch out for is, so if you have a variable that contains your beautiful array of stuff that you want to do something, you pass something into a web worker, and you say that you're going to transfer ownership of this object. Your UI thread no longer has access to that object. Again, I believe I'm correct in this.
You explained it better than I did.
So that's the gotcha with that if you're not paying attention to what you're doing, you will lose access to it. So say you kick this, so say you have, it's a very long running process for something, for some reason, because maybe there are cases where you want to start up like multiple web workers to do different things. So say you have we were talking about image processing. Say you have an image and you want to allow your users to I want you to adjust the contrast in this one. So you can kick off a bunch of different processes with it. But if you have one reference to that image data and you give access of that reference, if you give access to that to one web worker, you don't have access to it to pass it off to anything else. Especially if you have very long running processes, like something that's really going to sit and churn in the background for a while, you just have to make sure that you're cognizant that has happened, in case you have something else that depends on that value that you no longer have.
So one of the things Danny did mention was shared workers. So there's two types of worker. There's the standard worker where you do new worker, and there's also another instance or an interface called shared worker. So you can do new shared worker, and a shared worker can be accessed from several browsing contexts, even from other workers as well, which is good to know.
Yeah, and shared workers aren't quite. Yeah, the shared workers aren't quite as supported at this point in terms of browsers. Particularly, I don't know that it goes back into the IE world of things.
Yeah, so I'm just looking at support now. Chrome, Firefox, no support in Internet Explorer. Apparently, Safari looks like it does support it. But yeah, like you said, not as well supported as the standard worker.
Yeah, I mean, shared workers have they have their own set of values, but admittedly, I haven't. I mean, I've primarily stuck to web workers to process data off the main UI thread, just because I still have to deal with IE. So, and again, if you're out there and you're like, I don't have to deal with IE, you should still be aware of, what your use case is, because you don't want to leave users out in the cold.
Yeah, exactly. And we've mentioned a few kind of use cases for web workers already. Danny talked about filtering large lists. I've mentioned image processing. Are there any others you can think of? The key thing is obviously it's taking intensive work away from the UI thread. So I can think of a few. I don't know whether you have any.
So I have it's not specifically a use case of you can filter stuff. Actually, so partial shameless plug here, but I have a GitHub repository it's just a README, but it's just called things you can do in a web worker.
Cool.
That has a list of like things you have access to, like the file reader API, IndexedDB, web notifications, fetch, that kind of stuff, and a couple different use cases. So I have one use case, and then I have one that's maybe a larger use case, if that makes sense. So one of them is polling. So polling is really gross in general, and is usually something where you should switch to some sort of a push model rather than a pull model. However, if you have to do some sort of polling, web workers are a decent place to do that. If it's something that you have to do for some reason, they're a decent place to do it, because they abstract kind of the gross stuff you have to do behind the scenes, and then you interact with it more like a push model rather than a pull model. The other use case that I can see is actually building it into your client application more business type logic for use when your application is offline. Because in a lot of situations you want to push that that business logic to your back end. But then if you're building a progressive web app or something that you want to work offline, image processing is a good example, actually. There's no reason that if you're not connected to the internet that you can't still give an application a photo, have it do something to it, and spit it back out to you. And that is a do you understand what I say? It's not an exact use case. It's not an exact use case of here, filter a bunch of stuff, but it gives you the ability to do more stuff offline without affecting the UI performance of your app.
Yeah, I use it. I've used it in different ways. I used it to deal with prime data sets. So if we have big data that needs to be stored off into IndexedDB, because you have access to IndexedDB within a worker, you can do transforms while things are going on in the front. So if people are entering data or whatever, and I need to pull and get some stuff, because you can also get data off of a worker thread through the network interface. So you can do things like that, which again, you're basically making life nicer for the end user, because you're basically not locking up the thread doing a whole bunch of work that you just don't have to do. I've also done weird things with it, like WebGL things, where you basically run transforms and stuff off the main thread. This was a thing for a while, at least a few years ago, where there was a lot of experimentation. There are some older repos out there that sort of show how you can basically proxy things like WebGL through it. Though at this point, ideally, maybe we get off-screen canvas support at some point. I know it's in Firefox since I think the mid-40 versions of Firefox, 43, 44, something like that.
So is that so you can actually use Canvas in a web worker? Is that what you're saying, off-screen Canvas? I've not heard of that before.
Yeah, you can use WebGL off the main thread, basically.
Cool.
So Firefox, I believe you have to try. I'm almost positive you still have to. It's behind a flag still. I don't know its current status in Chrome, but yeah, you could do some pretty trick stuff. Basically by saying, oh well, I'm still not going to lock up that thread, which for me is nice. I would love to see that spec sort of become more widespread. That way you could do more things off thread. Yeah,
I can think of loads of things you could do. That's really good.
And I believe that Mozilla has a post about it. I will dig it up and stick it in the show notes.
Cool.
In terms of how you do it. But again, it's very similar. Basically, you just have an on message, and what that thread does, you can sit there and basically, run your gl.clears and draw arrays and all the normal things you would want to do within a context of WebGL.
Yeah, you mentioned IndexedDB as well, and I think when we had Nolan Lawson on talking about PouchDB, he mentioned that he wrote a whole article on how you can run PouchDB in a web worker as well to get additional performance. So there's another kind of use case.
Yeah, I think that's, as applications get more data heavy, where you are storing a lot more sort of information for quicker access, that you're basically priming existing things. And, to some extent, you can kind of do that now with Service Worker, from a network proxy standpoint, because there is a difference. Really, Service Worker is about that network proxy and sort of acting as that thing that is sort of between, that just makes sure your ability to do things on the network and getting the data you want nicer. But if you wanted to sort of go beyond that and sort of manage your data through another worker, you could use a web worker for that, and trigger those things when you need them, as opposed just to purely with the network request side of life. So you are going to get some difference between the two, which for a lot of folks, Service Worker these days, hey, keep implementing Service Worker. You can do all kinds of wonderful things with Service Worker. So I would not stop using Service Workers just to say, I'm just going to do it all in web workers. Don't do that. Use them both. They work wonderfully together.
So you mentioned, like, when you have like a lot of stuff that's stuff that's being saved, stuff that's sticking around, as it were. I know this isn't exactly what you're talking about, but another thing to be cognizant of is that the browser will clean up these threads for you. So you can, for a little while, cache values inside of a web worker, but you can't count on them being there. So you can store something in that web worker, but and at least this was the last time that I looked it up. But eventually, if that goes unused or whatever, and Chrome needs to, Chrome is already fairly memory intensive. Chrome has to clean up some of this stuff. It will go away. So you can't always count on it being there. Yep. So just a little side note, you saying that reminded me of this particular thing. So don't keep stuff in there.
But if you stash that stuff in IndexedDB, then you're good to go, right?
Yes. Yeah. I'm talking specifically about I have, variable foo equals whatever. And if that is getting set, when you're pushing stuff to it, that might not always be there. Absolutely. I actually think IndexedDB is one of the better use cases for some of this stuff.
Yep.
You talked about running PouchDB inside of a web worker. There are also, so Angular, for example, has an entire web worker bootstrap module, or platform rather. So that they've been playing around with, where you can actually run almost, except the parts that have to touch the DOM, it can run all of the change detection in a web worker. And I think there were some people messing around with React and using it inside of web workers and that kind of stuff. So we're talking mostly about fairly targeted things, but there are people that are just saying okay, what all could we do? Because you think about a super complicated bootstrap flow where you render server side to begin with, and then it bootstraps your client side JavaScript, and then it bootstraps your web worker JavaScript. But you think that's not, I do not recommend doing that. But it seems like that's the type of thing that's possible if you really wanted to.
Yeah, I think this goes back to a topic that sort of comes up on the show a lot, which is, where is sort of the architectural line, right? I mean, there's a lot of things you can do, but should you? Realistically, sometimes that's not the case, right? There's things that I just don't want to necessarily pound. I mean, I could sit there and spawn 20 threads too with workers, that's not going to be great for anybody. Like,
you could embed a Bitcoin miner in all of your applications and get free money.
Oh God, you know what's actually terrible is that you could. Like it's not.
I feel battery life would be impacted.
Yeah. So and that is one of the reasons that I think like Chrome has to or the browser in general has to clean up some of this stuff if it's just like what is going on here. But yeah, I mean technically I guess you could do that. Create a progressive web app that just mines bitcoins and say, hey everybody go install this. It'll be fine.
Well, and there are some, sans the Bitcoin side of life. I mean, we talked about Pouch, but there are other sort of libraries and sort of advanced tooling in JavaScript that uses web workers. I'm using one at the moment, Quagga, which is basically a advanced sort of barcode system you can define how many web workers you want to spin up when you're using it to basically scan barcodes. It's sort of my polyfill for, fingers crossed, shape detection, which is, again, random APIs Justin would like to see implemented at future scale, which Chrome's working on right now. I believe Paul Kinlan wrote an article about it back in December. But that one has web workers, and there's some other, if you dig around, you might be intrigued to find that you're like, oh, wow, I can offload some of this just by setting this nice little flag. Oh, I'm on, mid-tier devices. Maybe I just want one thread off thread. Oh, I'm on, I'm only featuring desktop devices. Maybe a couple, maybe 3. Check your libraries.
And the software we're using now to record this very podcast is using web workers, I believe. Is it to upload the tracks at the end of the session, or?
I do believe it does.
So there's another
shameless plug.
There's another use case is uploading large files kind of off the main thread, let the user continue doing what they're doing, and you can kind of just do that stuff in the background.
And when done well, it's quite a nice user experience, right? You don't get that janky lag. You don't have the, those horrible crash windows that often, pop up, which I don't, do you guys remember the ones that used to pop up? Like when IE would lock up and it would just spin there forever, and then it'd give you that window that says click OK, because OK was like the only button it had. And you're trying to click OK, but the thread's locked up, and it's like, I don't know what to do. And then just crumble. Those were the days.
You mean there's another window past that?
No, I never got to it. It just was always just a crumbling of effect. Like, those were not good days. Those were why did you decide to do computational important math on the UI thread? Which no platform, this is not, in case you're out there going, well, I don't work on the web. You shouldn't do computationally important math on the UI thread. Like, I'm just saying, like, normally speaking, probably not your best bet architecturally.
Yeah, a lot of this stuff probably seems pretty silly to people to anybody that doesn't work on the web quite a bit, which probably not a lot of our audience. But like I said, I just know I've talked about this type of stuff with other people, and they're like, it sounds ridiculous that you couldn't do this from the very beginning.
Well, and I think to some extent the fact that you couldn't do it from the very beginning just shows you why JavaScript continued to sort of expand, because the simplicity of getting ready for JavaScript and starting is simple. Like, you can sit there and open up a browser and write some code. Like, you don't even need the fanciest of sort of environments, like if you just want to write some JavaScript. And a lot of languages, as you both know, I mean, the reality is that you have to have a very, it's like trying to get started in C++. If you've never written C++ before, if you've barely read about it, like, it would be a difficult thing to understand how, memory and those things work. And I'm not saying you shouldn't learn those things. I think that's always, you should always be expanding your outreach of knowledge. But at the end of the day, like, the fact that a lot of people don't use web workers just shows you how how fast it is to learn to write JavaScript the way people want to learn it. And that's okay. Like, you get a basis, and then you're like, oh, wow, now I can do off-thread things. And oh, wow, that makes my performance better. To me, those are wins. Like, you know, over time, we've gotten better APIs, and as we get better APIs, the web continues to expand forth. I mean, say what you want, but it's only getting bigger. So we've talked a lot about sort of the benefits of web workers. You can use them now. We're going to put a lot of resources into the doc. Is there anything we've missed that, like, if you took one thing away about web workers today from this episode, what would it be, gentlemen?
That they're available and widely supported.
Yeah, and just, try and take a step back when you're implementing a new application or something and think, is there any point in this application where it could benefit from web workers? And I'm not talking about using web workers for web workers' sake. Just, think about it, know that they're well supported and can be used in lots of different situations that can really enhance the user experience.
I think those are two very fine points. So this has been, I believe, episode number 130. Do I have that number right, gentlemen?
You do.
That's right. It's what's on everything.
It's what's on the notes. We have been your hosts, Justin Ribeiro, Leon Revill, and Danny Blue. Gentlemen, it's been a good episode. I love web workers.
Me too. They're fun.
Thank you, Justin.
And we will see you next week.
Goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye.